All right, everyone, we'll get started while we wait for some additional people to join. Thank you to everybody who has joined us today. Welcome. My name is Kelly Leeson with the Refugee Self-Reliance Initiative, co-hosted by Refuge Point and the Women's Refugee Commission. Thank you to everyone for joining us to this event, promoting self-reliance in Jordan, a conversation on the graduation model and self-reliance. Today's event is part of a series of events to share the new Self-Reliance Index and to discuss self-reliance opportunities and programming. Please go ahead and feel free to introduce yourself in the chat box, and please put any questions that you might have in the chat box. We'll get to them at the end if we have some time. 3 weeks ago, the Refugee Self-Reliance Initiative launched the Self-Reliance Index. This index is part of a bigger, highly ambitious initiative that focuses on measurement, programming, advocacy to advance self-reliance. The initiative aims to measure programs to see if our clients are achieving self-reliance, and by doing so, to figure out which programs work best and for whom, and to advocate for an enabling environment in refugee hosting countries, and to advocate for donor support for refugee self-reliance programming early and everywhere. And while self-reliance for refugees was included as one of 4 objectives of the Global Compact on Refugees in 2018, it is during this global pandemic that we can truly see the wisdom and the urgency in supporting refugee self-reliance and investing in refugee resilience. I am thrilled today that we can bring together Caritas, Danish Refugee Council, Unhcr, and Norwegian Refugee Council to discuss how they are approaching self-reliance in Jordan. But before we dig into that, I want to take a few minutes to introduce you to the Self-Reliance Index. After 3 years of development that included piloting in Jordan with the Danish Refugee Council and Unhcr, the Self-Reliance Index now adds an important tool to the collective toolbox of humanitarian organizations. And if you're interested to learn more about how the Self-Reliance Index was developed, we will put together the link for the learning report in the chat box, and you can also find that on our website. The Self-Reliance Index is a holistic tool designed to measure a refugee household's journey towards self-reliance over time through periodic household reviews. The tool is designed to be easy to use and can be implemented as a standalone tool or as a complement to existing tools. We are thrilled to say that we have the Self-Reliance Index, the scoring guidance, and the user guide available in Arabic, English, French, Spanish, and Swahili. The SRI is also available on Comcare, ODK, and Kobo. And we have resources available through the generous support of our donors to support training and troubleshooting for anybody who is interested to use the tool. We welcome all of you to go to the website that we'll put in the chat box to download the tool and the accompanying products. And so I want to now start to think about, what does self-reliance mean? So we have a tool now that we can start to generate evidence, that we can measure self-reliance and that journey towards self-reliance. But that has been developed to support programs and to build evidence about what works. And today we will discuss the graduation approach as one of those programs that can help us to help refugees to achieve self-reliance. So the graduation approach is a program model that has been widely used in development contexts. And more recently, it's been introduced to the refugee context and the refugee space. And I will now hand it over to Lucas to provide us with an overview of the graduation approach before we kick off the discussion on self-reliance in Jordan. So Lucas, over to you.
Thank you very much, Kelly. So, hello everyone. My name is Lucas. I'm with Caritas Switzerland, as you already heard from Kelly, and I will just walk you a little bit through what is this graduation approach, which I'm sure that many of you know, but considering it's one of the very strong tools that could support refugee self-reliance, then we thought it would make sense to do first a proper summary before we get into different questions that are related to the topic. So what is the graduation approach? The graduation approach is a household level targeted intervention that aims to set households on a pathway out of extreme poverty through a series of careful sequenced multi-sectoral activities. So this is by the definition. What is important in this is that it basically brings together many individual sectoral activities into a sequence that has one clear objective, which is graduating people out of poverty. That hence the graduation approach. The graduation approach has relatively standard components, as you can see on the video now on the screen in the presentation, and while it's a household approach, it's embedded in the system market system development thinking and value chain thinking. So it's market based, and that's kind of a basis where it's coming from, and it continues with the sequence of steps that you can see on the screen. That I will start breaking down one after the other. What is key, or probably the most important one, is the mentoring. So what comes across in the graduation approach as the cornerstone of the success of the self-reliance activities that the graduation approach offers as a package is continuous mentoring that keeps focus on the household, on their livelihoods plans, on progress towards this livelihoods plan, and on their needs, specific needs, and how they can be satisfied. Then after this initial grounding and market orientation, thinking about what are the opportunities, what are the proper opportunities that are available in the areas, and after targeting exercises that are often looking at establishing localized understanding of poverty through poverty ranking exercises, then the refugees are set on a pathway to graduation, which we understand as in the first step, making sure they can participate. They can participate by having access to what we call consumption assistance or consumption support, which could be in-kind cash assistance very often, but it could be also different kinds of public works, cash for work in humanitarian contexts, for instance. In essence, any assistance that enables the households to offset their opportunity and other costs and focus on actually taking the risk and developing new capabilities, new livelihood streams that they would otherwise probably not even risk to develop. What is key is that we're talking here about extremely poor households. So that really differs from regular livelihoods programming, where we often would also hear that we should focus on those that actually can access livelihoods and leave the others to the social protection activities and social safety nets. So graduation approach works with the extremely poor and is aiming at bringing these out of poverty. After the consumption support, the sequencing continues to different kinds of training. Usually we would operate with the concept of core skills training, life skills, financial services, and financial inclusion, which builds the abilities or the livelihood assets, let's say, of these households to start saving, start having access to saving facilities, having skills that enable them to build their non-financial capitals, social capital within the community, the ability to bridge, to bind with the other members and with the power stakeholders, and basically creating sort of a buffer safety net that can encourage and support these households in resisting shocks. This happens alongside of other activities that are really then starting to focus on the income generation. Income generation is pretty much as many other livelihood interventions grounded in technical training, business training, and provision of seed capital. And we often talk about asset transfers. Asset transfers could be financial, could be in kind, it could be productive assets, but it could be in theory also things like certifications or advanced skills that leads to increased chances for wage employment. And this is then basically the end goal, having stable income streams that either come from wage or self-employment for these households, and that are diversified. Diversification is also key. Very often comes across in contexts where seasonality is an issue, because then we have often households that parts of the year they are very self-reliant, and then the other parts of the year they are dependent and negatively coping. So this is the rough outline of the sequencing within the graduation approach. When we look at the next slide, look at the next slide. Yes, thank you very much. We see these four big pillars that are basically taking the different parts of the sequence that I just listed and structuring them in sort of results areas. We are effectively looking at social protection being the ability to relieve their immediate basic needs of the households, and the purpose of this component within the graduation approach is for the households to retain in the program, be able to as I said, take the risk to actually start exploring new livelihood opportunities, not those that are used for negative coping or that are seasonal, but those that actually can provide sustainable impact and poverty relief. While this is the precondition, then the actual pathway goes then to the pillar 2, which is the income generating opportunities or activities that we build for these households, and they are diversified in different ways, of course, and they have to be sufficient. That's the key thing. And then the two other pillars are reflecting the financial capital from the livelihood assets and the social capital that needs to be built in order to safeguard these income generating opportunities within the households, to make sure that they have also buffers to face additional shocks that can come in the future, and be able to recover from them easily. So this is a little bit of the summary of what it is. Now, why it is and why graduation? There's a great body of evidence that proves effectiveness in transitioning from the extreme poor state into sustainable livelihoods for graduation, with a multitude of impact studies and the market control studies that are all they're all basically developed within the wide community of practice and supported by different actors. And many of you have probably heard of the recently launched Poverty Alleviation Coalition that also endorses this concept. And that leads me to a bit of an entry point on why are we talking about it in a refugee context now. We are talking about it in a refugee context now because since about 2017, there was a strong push to actually bring the graduation approach, was usually deployed in development contexts, into protracted crisis context and protracted displacement, which followed by different pilots studies, and which is also very closely related to the Refugee Self-Reliance Initiative, which generously took on the difficult tasks of actually measuring the outcome of such activities. And this transition, moving from development to humanitarian context and taking on this new challenge, this is something that is also the purpose of this webinar, partially to basically showcase where we can go from there, and how this evidence and how these experiences that also the members of this panel, but also others in the community of practice, bring to the displacement context with the graduation approach. So that would be probably a quick summary from me on what it is and why graduation approach at this point and in displacement context. Thank you.
Wonderful, thank you. so much, Lucas, for that overview to help center us in this conversation about self-reliance and why we're talking about that right now, and how the graduation approach can help us in a refugee context to support refugees in achieving self-reliance. So we're going to move now from Lucas's presentation to this conversation with our panelists. So let's kick that off. We have a great panel today with us. We've got, in addition to Lucas from Caritas Switzerland, we have Raoul Mitra from the Danish Refugee Council, Julie Kohler from Mercy Corps, and Julian Schweitzer from Norwegian Refugee Council will tell us about why this graduation approach has been chosen for this context, how it fits into a global discussion around self-reliance from support from UNHCR, who's brought together the Poverty Alleviation Coalition that Lucas mentioned. So Julian, can you kick us off and start us off on what does it mean to be self-reliant in Jordan, and why haven't we gotten there yet?
Sure, thank you, Kelly. And hello, everybody. I'm going to kick us off with a sort of bird's eye overview of the context in Jordan. And then I'm going to dig a bit deeper and give you 5 key points as to why we are not as far as I think we would wish to be with self-reliance in Jordan. So for those of you who are joining us from outside of Jordan and are perhaps not so familiar with the country context, just very briefly, we are in year 9 of the Syrian crisis. Jordan hosts now an estimated 1.4 million Syrian refugees out of a population of only 10 million. And that is then in addition to the Palestinian and Iraqi refugees that have already been in Jordan. So in other words, there are about 2 million non-Jordanians living in Jordan. And that makes Jordan one of the countries with the highest refugee population in the world, not in absolute numbers, but as proportionate to the population. And that influx of foreigners has, of course, strained services and infrastructure in Jordan and caused an overall stress to the economy. We've seen massive increases in rates of inflation, unemployment, poverty. And it's important to say that this is not only because of the influx of Syrians, but also because of the closure of the border with Syria. So trade has been cut off. And then it's good to remember that the Syrian crisis overlapped with the recovery of the world financial crisis in 2009, where Jordan was heavily affected. So a very bad mixture. Tourism, which is also one of the main sectors of Jordan, went down as a result of the Syrian crisis that just recovered, and now it's going down again because of COVID-19. So not a very easy context to live in. And since we're talking about self-reliance today, I also quickly wanted to mention that it's important to look beyond sort of the economic dimension of this. Important to remember that Jordan is also one of the most water-scarce countries in this world, and is now extracting water unsustainably beyond existing resources. That crisis usually doesn't get enough attention, but it's going to hit the country very hard in the very immediate future, 5 years more or less, unless dramatic changes takes place. And that is particularly important because agriculture is one of the main sectors of employment for Syrians. I think it's fair to say that despite all of these challenges, the government of Jordan has done and is doing a remarkable effort to cope. The Jordan Compact, which I'm sure everybody has heard of, is one of the most progressive policy instruments to promote the economic inclusion of refugees and has been an example, in fact, for other countries. And so it's really an extremely difficult context to be in. The government could do many things better, but I think it's important that we give them the credit to what they're already doing, and they're doing a good job at that. Zooming then into self-reliance. Self-reliance of refugees, but also of Jordanians, remains a major challenge. And that is primarily because of structural constraints in the economy. And I really want to highlight that structural piece. There are many, but I'm going to try to highlight very briefly just 5 of them. To start with, what is important to know is that population growth outpaces job growth. Jordan has one of the highest rates of population growth in the world, not only because of this large influx of refugees and migrant workers, but also because of high fertility rates. So we have a rapidly expanding working age population, but not enough jobs. So that's important to know. Second point is that overall, it's very difficult to do business in Jordan. Compared to other countries in the region, cost of business in Jordan is relatively high. Taxes, registration, utilities, labor costs. and most importantly, import substitutions outprice local products. So people with potential to become entrepreneurs are very often discouraged from doing so. And we see this lack of entrepreneurial acumen in the overall population. And that is especially the case for Syrian refugees because they are by law not allowed to own a business, or if so, in very difficult regulatory constraints. Third point then, and I think this is an interesting one from a program point of view, Jordan has one of the lowest levels of female labor force participation. In fact, it's the country with the lowest female labor force participation of a country not being at war. And that not only does damage to the economy, but also to the social fabric because it creates these inequities. And so self-reliance is much more difficult to achieve for women than for men. Combined with this, and this already speaks to one of the pillars of graduation, is overall low levels of financial inclusion. Only 25% of the Jordanian population has access to a bank account or a mobile account, and only 15% of the women, so even less for women. And that lack of access to finance then renders people very vulnerable to income shocks. And these may be caused by illness, by accidents, irregular payments, pandemics. And actually many households in Jordan have to indebt themselves to cover household expenditures, in particular rent. So the costs of living are also very high in Jordan. And then the last point that I want to mention here, and it's not as straightforward as the last ones, it's really a piece that fascinates me that I think we have to research more, and I would love to engage in a conversation with you on this one today, is the lack of motivation to work. So despite all the challenges I outlined beforehand, Jordan has an extremely low labor force participation, and that's a crucial point. So unemployment is actually not the main issue in Jordan. And remember, you need to fulfill 3 criteria to be classified as unemployed. You need to be not working, that's an obvious one. You need to be available for work, so you cannot be a full-time student or be permanently ill. And most importantly, you need to be looking for work. And it's really that actively looking for work piece that disqualifies the majority of the Jordanian population from being either employed or unemployed. So the majority of people in Jordan are outside of the labor force, have given up job search. And so I think what I want to argue is that it's the unemployment rate that should worry us. Only 34% of Jordanians are employed, and only 19% are unemployed, so looking for work. And we need to understand why that is, why people are not motivated to work. I think we know a few things, but as I said before, I do think we need to research this more. I need to understand better that motivational piece. There's an oversupply of highly educated people in the country, but at the same time, the labor market right now demands primarily informal, unskilled labor. There's a massive mismatch of expectations and the kind of jobs that people could access and the kind of jobs that people want to access. Combined with that, it's also the private sector that is not offering great working conditions. And the preferred employer in the country is still the public sector, because public sector jobs offer better wages, more job security, and are generally regarded as more esteemed. So people prefer to sit at home and would rather wait for a public sector job than go and apply in the private sector. And then combined with that, there's also a lot of WASTA, a lot of vitamin D social connections going on to get a job. So it's not a very merit-based society in that sense. And in many instances, it matters more who you are and who you know, as opposed to what you studied and the kind of qualifications you hold. And that naturally creates a level of frustration and disenfranchisement amongst the population. The other piece, which is then crucial, is that there's a very high reservation rate, both for Jordanians and Syrians. So people have a lot of expectation when it comes to salary levels and the kind of jobs that they are going to accept. And that is, I would argue, because the way in which the social transfers are allocated right now for the Jordanian population are quite ineffective. Many of them are based on categorical targeting, not necessarily on needs. And so many people end up getting a social transfer even though they have other forms of receiving income. And then for Syrians, I would argue it's almost the same. It's relatively easy to receive some kind of assistance from, us humanitarian folks in the form of multi-purpose cash assistance, participating in cash for work, etc., etc. So somehow people tend to get by, even though it's difficult. And as a result of that, they're less likely to engage in the kind of employment opportunities that are often available. And I completely see ourselves as humanitarians as part of this problem. I think we have distorted the economy to a large extent. And now this motivation piece is really one of the major issues that we are struggling with. Just as an example, we have an employment services program, and we realize that the majority of the people drop out of work after just 3 days of work. So we've placed them, they've gone for training, we've placed them with an employer, and after 3 days they leave the job. That's because the working conditions are not adequate, but also because the pay is not great, and then they leave. So the motivation piece is critical, and I think that is good food for thought when we think about the way in which we are going to design graduation programs, and speaks to the need of, for example, the coaching and mentoring component. I think I'm going to leave it here. And yeah, thank you for giving me the opportunity to talk and come in.
Thank you so much, Julian. That gives us a lot to think about in terms of our assumptions and how we do our work. And so I think Lucas might have something to add, and then we'll go on to the next question, because you bring up a number of points that I think are relevant to targeting then in the Jordan context. So I look forward to getting to that given what you've just said. But in the meantime, though, I'd like to hear from Lucas to hear what you have to say about why we haven't been able to achieve self-reliance yet in Jordan.
It's thanks a lot for passing the word, and thank you, Julian, for the elaborate and very detailed, comprehensive overview. I myself worked in Jordan for several years, and I think it very much reflects the situation, unfortunately. I would say that from structural perspective, and now probably having here as an audience professionals from humanitarian and maybe development side. One thing that in Jordan was particularly painful was the transition to the point where there will be an acknowledgement that the crisis is actually long term, and that we have to start looking at solutions that are more durable. And it's of course a political question in countries that are hosting refugees, then the time it takes for dialogue on durable solutions to actually be possible takes years. And in Jordan, it wasn't an exception, and it wasn't an exception just because this would be a problem politically. It's simply a problem in terms of financing horizons, in terms of estimating what is the value for money, in terms of investments into livelihoods programming. You would see many livelihoods programs that actually wouldn't simply take a sequenced and structured approach and focus on one or the other part of the sequence with various degrees of success. And then of course the following let's say unsuccess or failure, let's say, of the efforts to actually reach self-reliance. It's also a question of a wider, let's say, investments into the market systems, looking really at creating demand. Not only looking at the supply, which would be one of the problems that we would see in the first years of the crisis in Jordan. A lot of skills, life skills, technical skills training that if we were lucky would be actually linked to market needs. If we are unlucky, then we would get yet another hairdresser trained in Jordan that would be probably oversaturated already. So to me, it's a consequence of a number of structural factors, and also the perception of the return on investment is to me key. Like it's been not easy to basically put forward high price tags for actually creating sustainable livelihoods and really taking households and bringing them out of poverty sustainably, because this process is not cheap. Just putting a price tag on the different components in the graduation sequence, to everyone it's very clear this is a heavy activity. It's an approach that costs, And but on the other hand, it's an approach that actually makes the society a bit more equal, and it works. So these are, I would say, the factors that just from the top of my head are there to answer the question that you just posed.
Great, thank you so much, Lucas. So I think it was really helpful to hear from Julian and from Lucas about a number of the structural issues that create challenges to work in Jordan and really support refugees in this quest for self-reliance. And so, you know, then practically speaking, then Julie, if you can tell us about how then you are going about doing some of this work, how are you adequately targeting in the Jordan context so that we actually can reach the refugees that are interested in the programming that we have and that can be successful in this really challenging environment that they've just described. So we'd love to hear your thoughts on that, Julie.
So hi everybody. I want to come in here and kind of ground us again in the goals around self-reliance and why we connected to the Global Poverty Alleviation Coalition are really looking at graduation as a model towards moving towards self-reliance, right? And it's directly tied to the targeting conversation. So, you know, traditional graduation models that maybe haven't been done with refugees as much have looked at kind of extreme poverty indicators of targeting, right? And when we're looking at moving refugees towards self-reliance, we're actually, if you look at the Self-Reliance Index, you've got 12 different domains, right? There are a lot more things that you're measuring that are beyond economic measurements. So, you know, one of the things that we're doing and we're talking about as a coalition is really looking at targeting through the lens of vulnerabilities and looking at vulnerabilities that are connected to those self-reliance domains as ways to target. So we've had a lot of great conversations as a coalition, and then in some of the partnerships we've had, starting to think about implementing graduation programming in Jordan and thinking through designs that really look at, okay, so what are the psychosocial and mental health factors that are connected to getting towards self-reliance, and what are indexes that measure those and that can give us indicators for that. Things around mental health, things around stress, things that coaching component of the graduation model would help us actually get towards those aspects of self-reliance, and recognizing that those are a part of being successful in the environment that we're describing that does have its challenges in it, but that there are opportunities within that, especially if we're doing that coaching component right in graduation. So a lot of those conversations have been around identifying vulnerabilities beyond the VAF assessment. And really thinking through what are some of the other indexes that we might be able to use to really get at some of those vulnerabilities, especially because if we were targeting at an individual level, we are really looking at a very large youth population. So what are some of the indexes around targeting youth who are at risk, combined with kind of household level targeting, right? So the Self-Reliance Index is more of a household level measurement. And so what is that combination that will get us targeting the right households with those individuals inside the households that are going to be predominantly youth, who we're trying to support into livelihoods through the graduation model programming. So we've had conversations as a coalition looking at vulnerabilities that might be measured by the Human Insecurity Index, by the Arab Youth Mental Health Survey, by the Youth Child Resilience Measure, and doing a combination of those in our targeting methodologies. So it really is about expanding beyond extreme poverty economic indicators and moving into indicators that are really going to represent those domains in self-reliance. And again, it's tying back that self-reliance index is very helpful in us understanding the impacts, right, the movement, but also the targeting processes at the same time when we're having these conversations. Kelly, you're muted.
Thank you. Yes, thanks, Julie. That's great to help give the real framing about how this all fits together. And Raul, you've worked in a number of different places. How do you see targeting as different for the graduation approach in Jordan compared to other places that you've done this work?
Yeah, thanks so much, Kelly. Just to echo what Julie was mentioning, I think participant targeting is one of the crucial components of the graduation approach and core to ensuring that a level of vulnerability is reached that otherwise might not be reached through other livelihoods programs. I think honing in on the profile of the households at the bottom of the economic ladder is actually quite challenging, just because the nature of marginalization and social isolation is actually very complex. It's important to go, as Julia was mentioning, beyond the economic metrics and identify households who are caught in the poverty trap and understand why that is truly the case. I think when you're targeting in the graduation approach, it's essential to keep in mind that the targeted beneficiaries have capacity to engage in a livelihood activity. It's also important to question our preconceived notions about who is enabled and who is defined as unable to engage in such activities. It's important to target based on a wide definition of poverty, and then refine the program interventions and not have a predetermined set of interventions for which you try to find candidates. I think from a global experience of implementing graduation approach, it has been an extremely effective tool for households with a wide various forms of disabilities, socially excluded households such as indigenous and minorities, as well as single female-headed households. From my personal experience in Jordan, I would say that it's important to not start from scratch. One can use the National Social Protection lists as well as database maintained by UN agencies, for example, the Unhcr. That gives you a good place to start to at least derive a long list of participants to then hone in on. However, I think the most crucial component of targeting is the outreach within identified pockets of poverty, and then using a snowball sampling methodology at the grassroots level. I've found that working with community-based organizations can also provide that into the community and reaching households that otherwise may not be accessible to NGOs such as ourselves. I think it's also important to keep in mind that poverty itself can vary within a household. So, for example, I think youth, people with disabilities, and women tend to be more vulnerable to poverty than other household members. So it's important to have an individual lens to understanding poverty and not just a household level lens too. And speaking, I guess, for Jordan, it's important to, and I guess also other contexts where there's refugees and host communities, it's important to target both host communities as well as refugee populations when you're implementing graduation, just to ensure that you achieve that buy-in from the host communities. And when designing a program where you encompass both refugees as well as host communities, it's important to keep in mind that usually those two populations operate in quite a different set of constraints as well as different set of opportunities that are available to them. So the graduation approach project includes both refugees and host communities. I think targeting has to be designed and implemented independently because the very nature of poverty might be quite different for each of those subsets of the population. So I think those are the core elements that I would keep in mind as I'm targeting beneficiaries in Jordan or other contexts, honestly.
Thanks, Raul. You point out a number of really important things that we need to be thinking about. And I think, crucially, you mentioned, making sure that refugees and host communities are both included in programming. And I think we've moved a lot more in that direction, but we can certainly do more and really make sure that our programming is designed for to be inclusive and how important that is for our work. And so, Raul, staying with you for a moment. So then thinking about, what Julian and Lucas said at the beginning, they talk about a number of structural constraints in Jordan. So for you, what then are the aspects of the enabling environment that speak directly to the graduation program? And given all that they've said, what are some of the enabling environments that speak to this program, this model that's been described, and how do we make success in that?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think enabling refugees to work in Jordan has sort of received a renewed attention over the last couple of years as a way to combine development needs of host communities with the humanitarian needs of the refugees themselves. I think this has been complemented by a growing body of evidence that suggests that refugees and local economies contribute to economic growth and can thus be mutually beneficial for refugees as well as the host communities themselves. And I think in general, access to work reduces pressure on households, reduces pressures on refugees and host communities equally, and can contribute to the local economy growth, easing the social pressure on the country as a whole. I cannot think of a country where the humanitarian development nexus is more relevant than here in Jordan. As others had mentioned, this is 9 years into the Syrian crisis. And I think as a humanitarian or development organization, it's important to extend more holistic, longer-term approaches to refugees while keeping in mind the lurking presence of sort of the humanitarian-esque needs, such as the need for psychosocial support. I think the government of Jordan has undertaken a lot of policy shifts to foster socioeconomic inclusion, not just for vulnerable Jordanians, but also for the refugee populations. And I think there's also a shift that's happening in the donor community to increase investment in more longer term approaches and thinking. And that term, I think, self-reliance and building those capacities is much more relevant now here in Jordan. Jordan is trying to encourage an entrepreneurship and sort of startup culture within the country. I think we've seen a lot of startups emerging out of Jordan over the last couple of years. And in general, the government has been receptive for international support in driving that change. That being said, obviously, as was highlighted by Lucas and Julian, I think Jordan, there's a lot of different challenges. It's important to keep in mind that Jordan is one of the most affected countries from the Syrian crisis and hosts the second highest share of refugees per capita in the world. And I think according to the most recent survey, about 78% of Syrian refugees live below the poverty line. So I think there's opportunities, there's also barriers, and I think we sort of have to play the fine line. But I really cannot think of a country where the graduation approach can be tried out for the humanitarian landscape better than here in Jordan.
Great, thank you, Raul. And Julie, did you have anything to add to that in terms of the enabling environment and anything that we also need to be thinking about beyond, that there's this ability to work in it, Raul? It's really encouraging to hear that that's starting to come back into the conversation. Thinking about the startup culture, that is evolving there. Julie, anything to add to that or to deepen our understanding of those ideas?
So I might add a couple things. I think that when Lucas and Julian lay it out, there are a lot of barriers, like Rahul is saying, but at the same time, there's a ton of opportunity because we do have this massively educated workforce. We do have a lot of youth who have a strong willingness to work. I mean, every time we have conversations with the communities that we're working with, there's this willingness from youth. And it is about coming at them with the right combination, right? So it's not just livelihood programming at this point. That's why we're moving towards this conversation around graduation. It's that coaching component that really looks at some of those psychosocial stressors inside the household and really dealing with those so that they can engage effectively with livelihoods and roll with the changes that are going to come and deal with the toxic stress that they're coming into these situations with, right? But that youth population is ready. We also have this massive population of women who are not in the workforce, and that is an opportunity because there is a willingness there, but there are challenges to overcome. So kind of thinking about it from that perspective, if we just think about some of the spaces where there is opportunity as well that are associated with kind of the graduation intervention, that financial inclusion piece and the momentum around mobile wallets and mobile access to finance in Jordan is actually a massive opportunity in this space as well, as far as combining that access to finance with the livelihoods and moving towards livelihoods. There's also, I think, a whole lot of potential. One of the adaptations in Jordan, speaking to the barriers Lucas and Julian are identifying, one of the adaptations we're going to have to make in our programming and graduation is thinking really about the working on creating jobs, right? And thinking about the sectors that we really can create jobs in. And so tech-enabled work, remote work, gig economy work, which also happens to a lot of times fit into a post-COVID world, right? There is quite a bit of opportunity in Jordan to grow those spaces. And so we really need to be thinking about what are the economic development and market development backgrounds that we need when we're working with a graduation model, right? So in other circumstances where graduation models have been implemented, there's not really that market system development background to the graduation model programming. And this is a context where there is the opportunity to do that. And that is one of the pieces of I think, the enabling environment and the adaptations we're going to need to make to the graduation model in Jordan, or we are making to the graduation model in Jordan.
Julie, you mentioned youth in there, and there was a question from Alyssa in the chat asking about how do you define youth in the Jordan context, for some clarification?
So that's a great question, and I think it depends on the youth program that you're speaking to in a lot of circumstances. So from our perspective, that is often a definition that goes from 16 to 24, but that it depends on the program, right? And what is being identified as youth in that space, like in many other contexts when there are not opportunities to go into work or go into a marriage situation. The idea of youth and being young sticks around for a lot longer. But I know Rahul and Lucas and Julian would have sort of definitions in their own organizations, but that's the one we tend to work from.
Great, thank you. So it sounds like it varies, and that's helpful to know that it varies as well. So I want to move on to asking, because we're getting close to the end of time, Rahul and Julie, your organizations have been considering self-reliance, and you've been working with the Self-Reliance Initiative to be pilot organizations for the Self-Reliance Index. And Kennedy, all the way from Zambia, asked about the different components of the Self-Reliance Index. So I'm just going to put that up there so that people can see the different components of the index. But I would like to ask both of you, Julie, you touched on it a little bit before about why you have been interested in being involved in the initiative. So I'll start with Rahul then. Can you talk to us about why DRC got involved with the Self-Reliance Index development as being one of the pilot locations? Because it is, a time resource that we're using with your staff as they help us to learn and iterate on these models. So can you talk about your organization's interest in being part of the pilot and anything you want to share about using the Self-Reliance Index?
Definitely. I think from the Danish Refugee Council's perspective, we saw SRI as a potentially powerful tool to ensure that affected communities remain at the center of all our programming, as well as our advocacy that are evidence-based and informed by accountability towards the affected communities that we serve. I think second, while sort of promoting self-reliance amongst displaced populations, it's always been the core of what DRC does, but we recognize that we lack that composite indicators that enabled us to comprehensively understand and measure the outcomes of our programs. This is not sort of output level measurement. This is more of an outcome level measurement. And even within outcome level, this is more looking at longer term self-reliance and the resilience capacity of a household, not just whether a household has a job or is employed after 6 months of program implementation, or how much income they're generating, but if it's actually leading to those effective longer term behavioral change components that we actually want to achieve. I think DRC Jordan specifically has been a pioneer to that extent. We started our journey with the SRI, I believe it was about 2.5 years ago at this point in time. And thanks to the SRI team for sort of providing the training to our monitoring and evaluation staff, we've been able to pilot it in a wide range of contexts, not just with refugees living in the urban context, but also in the refugee camp context, but also with host communities themselves. So our experience has confirmed and sort of validated the relevance of SRI for the type of work that we do.
Thank you, Raul. And I would like to mention as well that as we've been working with the different organizations to pilot the SRI, as I noted, we just launched the tool. This really was developed, to be a universal tool, holistic tool looking at self-reliance. As more organizations have been taking on the graduation approach, we've been working very closely with Raul in Jordan and his colleague Solen at DRC to see how we can, on behalf of the Poverty Alleviation Coalition, make some complementary questions to the SRI to make sure that it is as relevant as possible for the graduation approach. So just wanted to note that that is something that we're working on, because the tool was developed for just general programs, but with the graduation approach there are some specific needs, especially around income, that we've been working on. So any of you who are working on the graduation approach, please note that there are some modifications that we're looking at and we're thinking about to make sure that it's as relevant as possible for this model in particular as well. Julie, do you have anything else to share from the Mercy Corps perspective about working with the Self-Reliance Index or the initiative?
Yeah, I'll just share one more thing. I think from Mercy Corps' perspective, at a global level, we have a really strong internal focus on resilience, right? And so looking at this, the nexus of humanitarian and development work, and Jordan being the perfect example for that, really what are our indicators where we can really work with refugees in holistic ways in order to move them towards resilience, right? So that the idea that social capital is being measured, and the idea that aspects of social capital are being measured was a huge part for us in wanting to be a part of that pilot and really seeing the value in this combination of measurements, right? Because we knew that those were some of the pieces that were really going to make some of the disparate programming that we had been doing before, whether it be cash transfers or access to finance or livelihoods programming or the youth psychosocial support, that was really going to help us measure when we brought this all together. And we knew that bringing it all together was really a part of where we needed to go in order to really meet the needs where Jordan is right now in this space between humanitarian and development. And so really the fact that we are looking across domains, we are really looking at in depth what is a household need in order to sustain long term, and not just thinking about concrete assets, but really thinking about the social capital side of things was really important to us as well.
Great, thank you, Julie. And to mention, really to highlight that the holistic nature of the tool, it really was developed to really capture what is going on at that household level, looking at all the different facets. And we're so grateful to our partners who did help with the piloting process. Once again, there is a learning report. We can once again plug that link into the chat box. But also, as Raul mentioned, we do have training resources for partners who are interested to use the Self-Reliance Index to make sure that they're trained up and receive the support that they need to be able to use it reliably. So just want to note that. And we'll take one more question before we close up. We have a question from Adi about and Philip, I think, about small businesses in Jordan and how to support small businesses in Jordan, given some of the structural issues there. And Julian, can you go ahead and help us out with that question?
Sure. I don't know if I have all the answers, but I can perhaps point to the complexity. So I think the good news is that the Jordanian government is very active in the way in which it regulates the labor law, but it's also immensely complex and it changes very frequently. So we have a whole dedicated legal team to help us understand what we can do and what we can not do. But in general, there are 4 sectors that are open to Syrian refugees in Jordan. So agriculture, construction, manufacturing, and parts of the service sector. There's a very strong work permit regime, so you have to have a work permit in order to work. But it's very unclear, and that would allow you to go into wage employment primarily. but it's very unclear under what conditions you can run your own business as a Syrian refugee. So running home businesses is a very gray area in Jordan. You would probably start off somewhat informal and then would need to formalize at some point. But again, the law around this is not clear. And so I think many of us have stayed away from this because there's been a protection risk involved. If we push people into informal employment, what does it mean for the legal status, et cetera, et cetera. But I welcome the others to chip in on that. And I quickly wanted to go into the other question that Adi had posed on the 70-30 splits and the way in which we would target, because I think that's relevant for the graduation model. So under the JRP, there are two windows, right? There's the refugee response and then there's the resilience response. Under the refugee window, we target by 70% Syrian, 30% Jordanian. Under the resilience angle, it is the opposite. So 30% Syrians, 70% Jordanians. It's very arbitrary, and I think everybody is recognizing that. So there's a big push from government to change that and to come up with a more equitable solution. And so the government has been working, I think, with Unhcr, WFP, UNICEF, on what they call the Joint Comprehensive Vulnerability Assessment, JCVA, that aims to create a universal targeting mechanism by which you could really identify who are the people that actually need support, regardless of their nationality. It's still work in progress, but I think if we can get that right, that's the kind of tool we really need for good targeting, and that is relevant for the graduation approach. Because right now it's really a piecemeal. The NEF has two different targeting mechanisms. We have the UNHCR list, we have our targeting. So it's really, really hard to get it right.
Thank you, Julian. And I'm glad we were able to get some of the questions. I know that can be a challenge when we have panels. So thank you for answering those questions, responding to what's on people's minds. And thank you to all of you for sharing your experience and insights about the graduation approach in Jordan and your experiences in Jordan. With 70 million refugees in the world and a world rocked by a pandemic, we know that we have to do things differently. And this panel really highlights the need to rethink our solutions, the need to have an evidence-based programming, and the importance of a collaboration. Having all of these different organizations on this call today shows us how all of you are working together, thinking through these issues together, and that's what we need to be doing. The organizations that are part of these discussions are leading the way in creating new and inclusive pathways for self-reliance for refugees and for host communities. The Refugee Self-Reliance Initiative is interested to promote self-reliance and convene these critical discussions. And so if you're interested to join us, please email the Better Lives Now email address. We'll put it in the chat box, or go to our website. You can join us that way. And please download the Self-Reliance Index. We're happy to support your organizations to use the Self-Reliance Index, so please check out the Self-Reliance Index. And please also let your colleagues know about the upcoming events that are listed here. We have an event that's focused on East Africa next week. We'll be having a Twitter chat next week as well. We'll be celebrating with UNHCR for World Refugee Day, Uplifting Refugees, and also a deep dive so you can really dig into the Self-Reliance Index with the following week. So please go to our website, register for those events, and we really hope you will join us and help us to promote self-reliance. So thank you to all of the participants, thank you to the panelists, and thank you to all the participants for joining us today. Thank you so much for being part of this series with us. Take care.